Hello, this is Charlotte Haller. Welcome back to U.S. History 111. I'm excited to welcome you to week 3. In many ways, this week is continuing the same kinds of analysis and issues that we were looking at last week. So we're continuing to explore the effects of industrialization. We're continuing to explore the sort of limits of economic expansion and economic improvement. And we have several readings that look into American expansion and American imperialism. So what I thought I would do for this week is to kind of walk through the process of looking at primary documents, especially the ones provided on the American YOP reader, but I'll also talk a little bit about the ones, the two that are provided in the textbook as well, just to kind of give you a sense of where these primary documents are coming from and how I'd like you to think about analyzing them or working with them. So, one theme that we have this week is on immigration. And in American YOP, you have an image of Mulberry Street from 1900 that depicts, although it doesn't explicitly say so, a neighborhood of immigrants. It's a tenement neighborhood. It's the neighborhood that in one of the documents a little bit later, Jacob Riis, in his piece on How the Other Half Lives, is going to be describing the incredible poverty that exists there. So one question that's a little bit in the background this week is the question of immigration. There's also discussions of immigration restrictions, particularly Chinese exclusion. So there's a document on that in American YOP as well, the James Phelan document on why the Chinese should be excluded, and looking at the reasons why immigration restriction is justified, I think is really interesting. And as I'm sure you all know, immigration is a huge political issue right now. So looking at sort of continuities, changes, etc. One piece that I thought was a really interesting document was Andrew Carnegie's 1885 piece on Americanization. And he has a vision of immigration that I think is very different than the one I think we're often kind of indoctrinated with, which is the idea of the melting pot. And that America kind of is all these immigrants coming together. We create a new culture. This is a much more sort of vibrant and exciting culture. Andrew Carnegie isn't interested in that. He adopts the idea of Americanization and homogenization. So his idea is that immigrants come to this country and give up their old culture, give up their old ways, and take on what he views as British English values. They're educated along an English system. And then the result of that is a stronger nation. And I just want to read one quote to you from Carnegie. "There is no class so intensely patriotic, so wildly devoted to the Republic as the naturalized citizen and his child. For little does the native-born citizen know the value of rights which have never been denied." So I thought that was a really interesting quote, and I'm curious to see on the discussion board what you all think, especially in terms of the connections to today's politics. So this idea that immigrants are particularly patriotic, particularly vibrant to America, not because they bring in their own culture and shake things up, but because they are so thoroughly indoctrinated into American culture. There's also a set of documents that kind of ask us to explore the boundaries of freedom. And here I think there's some really interesting contradictions between the way the textbook talks about things in specific ways and the way that these documents. So I just want to briefly talk about Charlotte Perkins Gilman's piece, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, and just to point out that your textbook emphasizes that this was, I believe the term that they use, is that it's the women's era. So this is a time of advancement for women. They do kind of acknowledge that the suffrage movement and the feminist movement at the time embraced racism and segregation as part of their platform, their political strategies, but they kind of point to the increased professional opportunities, educational opportunities. And here you have Charlotte Perkins Gilman writing in 1913 in a way that's very critical of the so-called women's era, but you can also sort of think about, are there ways in which she is a like product of this women's era? She's an author, she's published, she clearly has kind of found her voice. But in that piece, and if you haven't read the short novella, The Yellow Wallpaper, it may make less sense to you. But The Yellow Wallpaper is basically the story of a woman kind of trapped in this room with yellow wallpaper. She's suffering, a mental breakdown, basically, and she fixates on the wallpaper in the room. What Gilman argues in this piece is that she was basically driven mad, driven crazy by the forced domesticity that was prescribed by her doctor. He told her that she shouldn't have a kind of intellectual mind for more than a couple hours a day, and that this made her life worse. And she ends with another kind of interesting quote about her book. It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy, and it worked. So this idea that cataloging, describing the experiences of her experience of mental breakdown is in fact empowering to others, I think is a really interesting point. There's another collection of documents that talk about the situation of African Americans in the South, the question of lynching and the role that it played in the broader community, the ways in which African Americans attempted to navigate opportunities, citizenship, their lives within this environment is a really significant and important one. So I would just draw your attention to the Henry Grady piece, where he talks about the New South, talks about the sort of excitement of a world without slavery, but also insists that the South has nothing to apologize for. And, for me, the interesting question is the connection between Grady's assertion of this wonderful New South and Ida Wells Barnett's piece on lynching, and then the debate in your textbook between Du Bois and Washington, and kind of how they are trying to figure out what's the path. And I think we need to be aware that the broader context is intense violence, hatred, segregation, that's in the process of being built up at this moment. So perhaps not surprisingly, you're going to see a lot of debate. Lastly, I just wanted to mention the fact that you have a collection of documents about American imperialism and the sort of new American empire that's exemplified by the Spanish-American War. A lot of those documents are tricky because they're sarcastic and satirical. So those are always hard, I think, for us, in 2017 to go back and kind of put ourselves in the sense of humor of almost 100 years ago. Or more than 100 years ago. So for some of those, you need to read them twice, I think, to get them. And you still may feel a little shaky on what's being said, what the joke is. Mark Twain's War Prayer in particular, which is the final document this week, read it a couple times. Like, there's a subtle argument that's pretty clever and biting, but it may take a little while to get there. So I'm interested to hear from you if you find this kind of like breakdown of the documents helpful at all. If there's other kind of things that you would like me to address in these short introductory videos to the week. Hope everything is going well with you. I'm starting to get a feel for the rhythm of this course. I hope that you are as well. If you have any questions, run into any problems, always never hesitate to get in touch with me. Have a good week. I will see you next Monday, hopefully with good news after the Super Bowl. So take care. Bye.